I want to thank Harry and the South Shore Leadership Center for inviting me to speak to you. It's certainly my honor. What I want to do is I want to talk about becoming an effective leader. And while I'm speaking, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. If I say something that maybe you disagree with, just keep it to yourself. No, bring it up, please. When you talk about leadership, anytime you look at a successful organization, leadership is the quality that distinguishes good and bad organizations. And the reason for that is because leaders are the principal problem solvers. They're the principal decision makers. Leaders have a direct influence on the performance, on the behavior of employees. And so when you talk about the importance of leadership and successful organizations, it's something that I think we need to improve upon. What do we mean by leadership? Various definitions of what it means to be a leader, what leadership means. One definition is by leadership, we're talking about the ability to influence the behaviors of others in a certain direction. All of you are leaders, and so I'm sure if that definition doesn't apply to you, the second definition of leadership. By leadership, we're talking about the ability to influence the behavior of others to accomplish organizational goals. When you talk about the skills that an effective leader needs to be successful, we can generally categorize them into three. There's three types of categories. One are what's known as technical skills. And by technical skills, here we're talking about having a general understanding of the specific jobs that the leader is going to be supervising. Another category of skills that a leader needs to be effective are what's known as interpersonal skills. And by interpersonal skills, we're talking about the ability to understand not only individual, but also group behavior. Because keep in mind, how a person behaves as an individual may be different from how they behave in a group. I'm oftentimes amused when I see my students outside of class. When they're in class, they're very quiet, but then I see sometimes when they're outside of class with their peers, and it's like they take on a different personality. I'm sure you've seen that. I'm sure you've got multiple personalities depending upon who you're interacting with. One last category of skills necessary for effective leadership, and these are what's known as administrative skills. And you might want to think of administrative skills as having a working knowledge of the entire organization, seeing how your department or work group fits in with the rest of the organization. When you talk about these three categories of skills, what's interesting to note is that depending upon the level of management, these different categories of skills are used in different amounts. For example, if you look at a lower level manager, a lower level supervisor, a lower level leader, they will use technical skills 35% of the time, interpersonal skills 60% of the time, and administrative skills approximately 5% of the time. If you look at somebody in middle management, they'll use technical skills approximately 20% of the time, interpersonal skills around 60% of the time, and administrative skills 20% of the time. And notice somebody in top management. Once again, technical skills 5% of the time, interpersonal skills 60% of the time, and administrative skills 35% of the time. What this shows you is that regardless of what type of leader you are, regardless of your leadership position, regardless of your leadership level, those interpersonal skills remain equally important. And the reason for that, when you think about what a leader does, a leader is a person who gets things done through other people. Regardless of what position, regardless of what level of management, a leader is a person who gets things done through others. And so, this graph shows you that the most often used leadership skill are those interpersonal skills. One of the keys in terms of leadership skills, or should I say interpersonal skills, is the ability to control our emotions This can be very difficult because of all the pressures, because of the different roles that a leader has to perform. You know, how old are you? Well, that depends on you know, there are different ways of defining that. There's a chronological age. Here we're talking about how many years you are, how old you are in terms of years. We also have a psychological age, and here we're talking about how old you feel. How old do you feel? Do you feel your age, or do you feel younger? Do you feel older? Because I work at the university, and I deal with a relatively large number of young people, I feel younger than what my years are. You know, Harry mentioned that I've been at the university since 1983, but I don't feel it because the students, they help to keep me young, at least psychologically. But the other type of age that we need to be aware of is what's known as emotional age. And here we're talking about how old we act. And how old we act has nothing to do with your chronological age. There are some very young individuals I know who come across as being very mature. At the same time, there are older people that I know, more mature. And some of them come across in terms of the maturity level, it leaves you know, very emotional. One of the keys to controlling your emotions is to have what is known as emotional intelligence. And by emotional intelligence, here we're talking about the ability to monitor, to understand, and importantly, to control your emotions. Some people tend to label emotions as either good or bad. In other words, some people tend to say, well, good emotions are love, are joy, happiness, and bad emotions are fear, anger. Well, in reality, all emotions serve a useful purpose. When you talk about the purpose of emotions, you know, when you talk about fear, when you talk about anger, when you talk about sadness, when you know, they all serve a useful purpose. What emotions do is they communicate our feelings. There's nothing wrong with being angry. There's nothing wrong with having fear, as long as we express it in an appropriate way. And so, you know, when you talk about what is the purpose of emotions, well, certainly one way is to communicate our feelings. By communicating our feelings, this helps people to know who we are. Not only that, but another purpose of emotions is for self-improvement. In other words, through self-awareness, we can engage in what is known as self-development. The more we know about ourselves, the result is we can try to improve ourselves among others. Another purpose of emotions, you know, by understanding emotions, we can understand other people. And when you look at emotions from a leadership standpoint, very important that as a leader we understand emotions in order to understand our employees. And one other major purpose of emotions, you know, emotions provide us with motivation. They provide us with energy to act. That as a result of certain emotions, you know, we might be able to have the energy to engage in some activity that can help us. When you talk about different emotional styles, we all display different emotional styles. However, one tends to dominate over others. You know, we all display these three different emotional styles, you know, suppressing our emotions, overexpressing them, accommodating them. But for most of us, one style tends to dominate most of the time. When you talk about the style of suppressing your emotions, there are some people who disguise how they feel. There are some people who come up with strategies to avoid expressing their emotions. You know, this can have certain health problems in terms of headaches, high blood pressure, stress. The other extreme, There are some individuals who overexpress their emotions. And when you talk about somebody who overexpresses their emotions, here we're talking about somebody who has a lack of control. Sometimes they don't take responsibility for their emotions. Sometimes they play the victim role. They blame other people. You made me angry. It's because of you that, it's because of you that I cheat. It's because of you that I act the way I act. Well, once again, these are the extremes. The type of emotional style that we want to have, that we want to strive for, is what's known as accommodating your emotions. And here we're talking about recognizing your emotions. We're talking about accepting your emotions. And more importantly, we're talking about expressing your emotions in an appropriate way. I used to have a department head who was very good in terms of accommodating his emotions. And one of the things that he told me in terms of being effective, in terms of controlling your emotions, is that you always have to behave as a professional. Nothing wrong with getting angry. Nothing wrong with having fear. As long as you display those emotions in a professional, in a socially acceptable way. Oh, I was a big Star Trek fan. And when you talk about somebody who suppresses their emotions, I don't know if you know a lot about Star Trek, but Mr. Spock did not display emotions. Well, the question was, how effective was he in terms of interpersonal relationships? And the answer is what? He wasn't. He wasn't. People want you to express your emotions appropriately. People want you to act human. And when you look at Captain Kirk, he's an example of somebody who accepted his emotions and at the same time expressed them. And when you compare Captain Kirk with Mr. Spock, this was the individual who was effective in terms of interpersonal relationships. Every episode of Star Trek, Captain Kirk had a woman on every planet. The Enterprise would go to Pluto, and there'd be a woman that he dated, and then the Enterprise would go to Mars, and there'd be a woman he dated. When you talk about accommodating your emotions, this is what we need in terms of being effective in terms of we don't want to be a Mr. Spock. One of the keys to being an effective leader, and this is true in many things in life, is to have flexibility. In other words, it's known as style flexing. And by style flexing, we're talking about the ability to adjust your leadership style to the situation. That some situations may require one leadership style, another situation may require a different leadership style. In other words, to be an effective leader, you have to have that flexibility of being able to adjust your style to the employee, to the situation. In other words, to be an effective leader, you need to learn the behaviors of all leadership styles. Do you know who Father Flanagan was? Well, Father Flanagan founded Boys Town. And his idea was, back when Father Flanagan was around, juveniles used to be sent to prison with adults. Well, Father Flanagan believed that juveniles can be rehabilitated. And so what he came up with was something that he called Boys Town. Because his most famous statement was what? Who remembers? About?
There are no bad boys.
Right. Father Flanagan believed there's no such thing as a bad boy, that all kids have redeemable qualities. Well, we might want to take Father Flanagan's philosophy and apply it when we talk about different leadership styles. In other words, according to Father Ralph, there's no such thing as a bad leadership style. In other words, all leadership styles can be effective if used if used in the proper situation. You know, before I came to Purdue, I used to have another. Yeah, right. Right. I just want to talk about 3 different leadership styles and identify situations where they most appropriately be used. I want to talk about the authoritarian style of leadership, the participative style of leadership, and something known as the laissez-faire style of leadership. You know, normally when you hear authoritarian style of leadership, for many people that has a kind of negative connotation. When you talk about an authoritarian style of leadership, you know, we're talking about somebody who relies a lot on authority to get the job done. Somebody with an authoritarian style of leadership is into one-way communication. You know, they tell you what to do, how to do, and when to do it. They're very much into one-person decision-making. If there's a problem in the department, if there's a problem in the work group, they will come up with a solution. One of the problems with the authoritarian style of leadership is that sometimes it leads to what is known as a Theory X attitude. Anybody know what Theory X is? Theory X? This type of attitude is one where the supervisor believes that employees are irresponsible, they lack ambition, they have no initiative, you can't trust them, you have to constantly watch over them, otherwise they won't do their job. And so, you know, as bad as maybe this sounds, this type of leadership style does have its place. The question is where? Well, this is a very effective style of leadership to use whenever you're dealing with new or less competent employees. Anytime you're dealing with new or less competent employees, they need somebody to tell them what to do, how to do, when to do it. You know, they need somebody to lead the department or the team. This is an effective style of leadership to use whenever you're dealing with an emergency or a crisis. You know, sometimes during a crisis or an emergency, you need somebody to come in and basically take charge. You do this, you know, there's no time to consult. An effective style of leadership to use whenever you need to restore order, discipline, and control. That sometimes as a leader, you may be put in a new department where there's no control. Well, the result is you might have to resort to this style of leadership to gain control. You know, one of the ways that I financed my college education is that I used to be a dorm counselor. And I did that for 5 years. And I remember my first job as a dorm counselor. I was put in charge of a floor of juniors, mostly juniors and seniors. And I can remember the first floor meeting. You know, before I could even speak, you know, the seniors, you know, they were talking to the new residents. And they were saying, well, you know, we can have alcohol as long as we're discreet. We can have women after hours as long as we're discreet. And I remember these seniors talking about what the rules were supposed to be. Because this is the way things were with the previous dorm counselor. You know, violation of dorm rules. You know, well, I recognized that things were going to have to change. And you know, when it was my turn to speak, you know, I basically told them that there's a new sheriff in town. You know, the old ways of doing things are no longer going to be tolerated. And it was tough. It was tough living with a bunch of guys who already had their set way of doing something. But I recognized that either I'm going to control the floor or they're going to control the floor, which meant that there were no rules. And I'll tell you, the first semester was very difficult. But then after a while, you know, we began to get used to one another. And what I found is that I could switch from this style of leadership to something that was more compatible with the new situation, you follow? You know, situations change. And so sometimes you may come across a group of workers and you need a certain leadership style. But over the course of time, you know, as you and your employees get used to one another, you know, you can shift your leadership style to something that is accommodating to the new situation. And I found that over the course of time, I was able to basically alter my leadership style to the new situation. I remember my second year as a dorm counselor. They put me in charge of a floor of basically freshmen, new to the university, didn't know what to expect. And I remember the first floor meeting I had with the freshmen. I basically laid down the rules. Okay, there'd be no alcohol in the dorm. If I catch you with a beer, I'm going to write you up. They're all looking, and there'll be no women after hours. If I find you with, if there's a woman after hours, I'm going to write you up. They're all, stereos. After 5 o'clock, no stereo. Back then they had stereos. There'll be no stereos, and with a group of freshmen, my job was easy. Maybe you may have experienced that, comparing supervising older, more experienced employees with new employees. There's a difference in terms of how you go about dealing with them. But I remember with my second year as a dorm counselor, I caught this football player with a beer in the hallway. And I went up to him and I said, I better not catch you with a beer again. He's a big guy, He's like, here, I better not catch you with a beer again, otherwise, I'm going to write you up. Oh, I'm sorry, Ralph. I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. Once again, different situations require different leadership styles. And so maybe the first day, the first week, the first month, I was tough on the freshmen, and I was able to relax that after a while. Another leadership style, which is the participative leadership style. And here we're talking about a leader that is very much into two-way communication. Not only do they talk to you, but they listen. We're talking about a leader who relies a lot on interpersonal skills to get the job done. The type of leader who's very much into group decision-making, group problem solving. If there's a decision to be made, if there's a problem to be solved, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. This type of leader has what is known as a theory Y attitude. And when you contrast theory X with theory Y, theory X is sort of like a negative attitude toward your employees, while the theory Y is more of an optimistic, positive attitude toward your employees. A theory Y supervisor believes that his employees are responsible, they have initiative, you can delegate assignments to them. The point to remember about delegation, delegation is good, but you always want to verify because ultimately you are responsible. And so even if you do have a theory Y attitude about your employees, you believe that they have initiative, they're ambitious, they're self-motivated, you always have to follow up just to make sure you haven't made a mistake, just to make sure that maybe they might need help. Well, the question becomes, where would you use the participative leadership style? Once again, it's not effective in all situations. This style of leadership would be effective when employees want it. Keep in mind that not all employees want to be involved in decision-making and problem-solving. There are some employees who want to be told what to do, when to do, how to do it. And so when you talk about using the participative leadership style, your employees have to want it. They have to want to be involved in decision making and problem solving. And as I mentioned, there are some employees who don't. I just want to do my job. And when it comes to a problem, when it comes to a decision, you're the leader. You deal with that. That's the feeling of some employees. This style of leadership also requires that you have competent or experienced employees. When you talk about delegating responsibilities, the employees have to be capable of taking on those responsibilities. And lastly, one last major variable that is required for this style of leadership, and this has to do with the fact that there has to be time available. Getting input from other people is time consuming. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, sometimes there's not time available. Sometimes we're talking about a crisis or an emergency and time is not available. Well, one last leadership style that I want to bring to your attention. Anybody take French? Okay. Michelle, what is meant by laissez-faire? Say it again. Relax. I saw. Yeah, I saw another hand. Was it? Well, hands off. Relax. Non-intervention. Non-intervention. Right. Well, you know, when you talk about this leadership style, once again, we're talking. By the way, I took 3 years of French in high school, and don't remember any of it except for that. You know, I do know laissez-faire, but you know, and parlez-vous français, you know that, you know. But yeah, man, three years of French, and gosh, kind of disheartening. I always thought someday I'd go to France or even Canada, you know, but never made it, you know. Well, laissez-faire, we're talking about non-intervention, we're talking about hands-off. Characteristics, once again, group decision-making, group problem-solving, two-way communication. You know, think of this type of leadership style as a type of extreme theory. Why? In that the leader has a very, very optimistic, very positive view of his subordinates' abilities, you know, their self-motivation. Well, the question becomes, where would this style of leadership be most effective? Well, anytime you're dealing with experts or professionals, you can basically take a hands-off approach in terms of leading them. Anytime you're dealing with very competent, very experienced employees, you can take a non-intervention, a hands-off approach when leading them. Nowadays, you know, consultants and contractors have become very big in many organizations. Once again, laissez-faire style of leadership, hands-off. You know, oftentimes a contractor will come in with their own supervisors and leaders. And so, for the most part, you know, when you talk about laissez-faire, your role is not an absence of leadership, it's an absence of direct leadership. You know, there still needs to be a leader there. But in terms of how you deal with these types of situations, you're more of a resource person. You're more of a facilitator. You're more of an advisor. You're more of a mentor. And so once again, the key to leadership is to have that flexibility to adjust your style to the job situation. Self-managed work groups would be a situation where laissez-faire would be appropriate. Also, if you're the new supervisor, you know, sometimes if you're put in charge of, you know, you're the new supervisor in a work group or department, you know, before you go in there and start making changes, you might want to, you know, first watch and see how things are done. Maybe things are going well and you don't have to make any major changes. You know, having said this, having talked about the importance of flexibility in terms of leadership style, it's not always that easy. I'm sure most of us think of ourselves as being flexible, but it's hard to do on a long-term basis. Do you remember Mike Ditka? Okay. Yeah, Mike Ditka had a certain leadership style. And you know, you know, he would complain about the refs. He would complain about the play. You know, he had a type of leadership style where you know, he had no problem expressing his views. And I remember he had that heart attack, if you recall, and he missed a number of games, and finally, you know, he recovered. And I can remember that the cameras were on him. You know, his first game after the heart attack. And I remember the commentators making, you know, saying, "Oh, look, the new Mike Ditka." You know, the refs would make a call against the Bears, and you know, whereas before he'd go charging on the field. Now, you know, relax, you know, it's okay. A player would fumble the ball, and the cameras would be on Mike Ditka, and you know, you relax, everything okay. He was able to take on that new leadership style for a certain number of games. But then I remember, like, maybe the third game after he came back from that heart attack, something happened, and there was the old Mike Ditka. I mean, it's hard to change your leadership style. It's hard to acquire a new leadership style on a permanent basis. Most of us have a certain leadership style. And I said that, you know, you need to be able to adjust your style to the situation sometimes a lot easier said than done. Who's the president right now? Trump. Remember during the campaign, the advice that was given to Trump is that, hey, you need to let up. You know, if you really want to get elected, you need to adapt a different leadership style. Well, easier said than done. You know, much easier said than done. You ever hear Winston Churchill? Winston Churchill, during World War II, if you read anything about World War II, you'll come across Winston Churchill's name. You know, he basically saved Great Britain during World War II. But do you know what happened after the war? What happened with Winston Churchill?
He got elected out of office.
They voted him out of office. How can you do this to Winston Churchill? You know, Winston Churchill saved Great Britain. Ask any historian, they'll tell you that. But after the war was over, he was voted out. Why? Well, because the situation in Great Britain had changed. It went from wartime to peacetime. And Winston Churchill's leadership style was more effective in wartime. He didn't have the ability to adjust to peacetime. Billy Martin, you know baseball? Billy Martin was a manager for the Yankees, and he was hired and fired 5 times by the same owner of the Yankees. Wait a minute. Let me think about this. This guy was hired and fired 5 times by the owner of the Yankees. That doesn't make sense. Well, it does when you think about when you think about flexibility in terms of leadership. In other words, Billy Martin had one type of leadership style. And the owner of the Yankees knew that whenever the situation was this, bring in Billy Martin. But keep in mind, situations change. Maybe because, the players change or whatever the situation, it changed. So what do? You fire Billy Martin, you bring in somebody else to manage. Well, in several years, the situation will change again. You fire that guy, hey, you bring back Billy Martin. And this is, Courtney, you know about this in terms of sports. Anytime a team, and of course Harry, anytime a team is having difficulty, do you fire the players? No, it's too difficult. What do? You get rid of the coach and you bring in a coach whose leadership style is compatible with the players that he or she has. But once again, a lot easier said than done to have flexibility in terms of your leadership style. I remember my first job as a supervisor, as a leader. I was put in charge of they were basically younger people. And I remember the first day, I want you to do this job, I want you to do that job, I want you to do this job, and they did it. And I remember thinking to myself, man, what a job I've got, You tell people to do something, and they do it. A week later, I was giving out job assignments, and I said, and I still remember her. I said to this woman, well, I want you to do this job, and she looked at me and she said, no, I don't want to do that job. And I was like, wow, what do I do now? What do I do now? And so I basically let her do the job she wanted. Well, later in that day, I went and talked to one of the veteran supervisors, and I talked about the situation, and he said, oh, with this type of, he knew the employee. He says, well, when it comes to Michelle, you basically have to tell them what to do, and if they don't do it, you tell them to go home. Well, next day, I'm ready. I'm ready. Giving out job assignments, okay, and there's Michelle. And I said, Michelle, I want you to do that job. No, I'm not doing it. I said, well, you're going to have to clock out. Guess what? She did it. I mean, sometimes when you talk about adjusting your leadership style, sometimes, not only do you adjust it to the situation, but also to the individual employee. There are some employees, you can ask them to do something, they'll do it. But there are other employees where maybe you might have to rely on your authority to get the job done. One of the important skills that is required today are team building skills for every leader. When you talk about the way work has changed, the day of the individual artisan, the day of the individual craftsman working alone, for the most part, is over. Most work today is done in groups. Most work today is done in teams. And so recognizing that, today's supervisor has to have team building skills. What do we mean by a team? Well, a team is nothing more than a collection of people who rely on one another for success, a collection of people who rely on one another to accomplish certain goals. And there are many examples of a team. You know, a marriage is a team. People who rely on one another to get things done. A family is a team. People who rely on one another to get things done. A football team, an orchestra. So is an organization. An organization you might want to think of as being a team. For that organization to be successful, you have employees who have to rely on one another. Once again, I don't want to keep referring to Colleen and Harry, but I know they were involved in sports. And you know this already. A good team is not the one that is made up of the best players, but the team with players who work best together. In other words, one of the major myths of teams is that if you have highly competent, highly experienced workers, that's going to be an effective team. That's not necessarily true. You know, what's important is how well workers, players, get along with one another, are willing to cooperate, are willing to maybe sacrifice in order to get the job done. There's a concept in management referred to as synergy. And by synergy, we're talking about whether the performance capability of a team is greater or less than the sum of its parts. In other words, if you have a team, if you have a group of employees who work together, who cooperate, you're going to have positive synergy, whereby the whole will be greater than the sum of its parts. On the other hand, if you have a group of employees who are in constant conflict, who don't work together, it's going to be negative synergy, where the whole will be less than the sum of its parts. And so the point I want to keep in mind is that anytime you put people together to work as a team, you're never quite sure what's going to be the outcome. Is it going to be positive synergy or is it going to be negative synergy? Well, it depends upon whether the members of that team are willing to cooperate, work together. One of the requirements for effective teamwork is not only cooperation, but also trust. To be trusted, you must be trustworthy. And you know, trust is something that has to be earned. And so the question becomes, how do you earn the trust of another person? And it's difficult, but it's not difficult. It boils down to, once again, having effective interpersonal skills. That earning trust is nothing more than developing positive interpersonal relationships with other people, with your employees. You know, I like to think of interactions. You know, whenever you interact with somebody, there's the potential for trust to build, or there's the potential for trust to diminish, depending upon what happens during that interaction. You know, one way of characterizing interactions is that they can result in what is known as a deposit of trust in a relationship or a withdrawal of trust in a relationship. When you talk about a deposit of trust, you know, here we're talking about an interaction that builds, that strengthens, that repairs trust in a relationship. On the other hand, when you talk about a withdrawal, here we're talking about an interaction that results in a lessening, that results in hurting trust in a relationship. And so just to give you an example, you know, what are some examples of interactions that can build trust, that can strengthen trust, that can repair trust? contrast with those interactions that had the opposite effect. In other words, what are deposits to your trust account? You know, when you give somebody recognition, you make them feel good. You know, giving somebody praise, keeping promises builds trust, strengthens trust. Showing support, you know, having somebody's back is a way of building trust. And you know, when you look at what I call these deposits and withdrawals, you know, not only does this apply in terms of the workplace, but it also applies in terms of your personal life. Showing respect for other people. You know, treating your employees, treating your you know, other people as adults. Being fair with your employees, being fair with your friends. You know, these types of interactions, these types of behaviors will result in strengthening trust between you and that person. On the other hand, when you talk about interactions that tend to weaken or hurt trust, which I call withdrawals, you know, ignoring others. You know, there are some leaders who deal with their employees by ignoring them. You know, ignoring, I hate to use old English, but ignoring begets ignoring. What does that mean? Who knows old English? Ignoring begets.
It facilitates it.
Yeah. In other words, if I'm the supervisor and I ignore you, what are you likely to do? Ignore me back. I mean, you know, reciprocity. But remember, as a supervisor, you know, supervisors, leaders have to remember we need our employees. Because a leader is a person who gets things done through others. And so if we go about ignoring our employees, the result is not only does the job not get done, but this is a reflection on us. And so we have to remember that if we ignore our employees, they're going to ignore us. And the end result, nothing's going to get done. And not only that, but we're not going to get to understand them. They won't understand us. There's not going to be trust. Breaking promises. You know, I know some people who habitually break promises. I don't trust them. I don't trust them. And so, you know, I'll talk to them and you know, they'll say, oh, you know, especially when it comes to money, you know, Ralph, can I borrow some money? Well, you didn't pay me back last time, but this time I promise. Yeah, right, you know. Lack of support. I don't know why people think I have money. Maybe because I have a job. My friends don't. Yeah. But lack of support. If you don't support somebody, there's not going to be trust. Disrespecting other people, there's not going to be trust. Lack of fairness. If you're not fair to me, I'm not going to be fair to you. I don't trust you. In other words. Let's look at these. I gave you a. Let's see how well you did on my. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I do. You know, because I'm a professor, I had to give you some type of an assessment to take. Oh, Harry needs one. He needs it. Oh, do you? Okay. Well, Harry knows the answer anyway, so. So the first question, true, false. The need for interpersonal skills by a leader remains equally important at all levels, at all positions, leadership positions. True or false? True, right. Question 2, to improve emotional intelligence, a leader should suppress, avoid bad emotions. False, right. You know, keep in mind, you know, there are no bad emotions. In terms of their usefulness, in terms of understanding ourselves and understanding other people. The key is to express our emotions in an appropriate way. And as I mentioned, what you want to do is you always want to behave as a professional. So anytime you interact with your employees, behave as a professional would behave. And as I mentioned, I had that department head who's sort of like a role model to me. And anytime I'm dealing with a student or anytime I'm dealing with a situation, I try to keep him in mind. That I want to make sure that I keep control of my emotions and I deal with that person in an appropriate way, in a professional way. Effective leaders are born with leadership skills? False, right. You know, the nice thing about leadership is that it can be developed. That regardless of what type of leader you are right now, your skills can be improved. They can be improved. There's no such thing as a bad leadership style. What would Father Ralph say about that? That's false, right? All leadership styles can be effective if used in the proper situation. Generally, the performance capability of a team is equal to the sum of all members' abilities, contributions. Well, generally, the performance capability of a team is either greater or less than the sum of all. In other words, we're talking about synergy here, which can be positive or negative, depending upon whether people work together, whether they cooperate. And lastly, an effective way for a leader to build trust is by developing positive interpersonal relationships with other people. True, right. Once again, the most often used supervisory leadership skill are those interpersonal skills. And so whether we're talking about leading a group of employees or simply trying to establish trust between us and an individual, leadership skills, very important. One of the problems with leadership skills is that oftentimes people overestimate their interpersonal skills. Oftentimes people think they're better at their people skills than what they really are. And so we have to constantly monitor, you know, how we're interacting with other people, and maybe we need to make certain adjustments or improvements. I was waiting for that. Any questions?